For 6 months, the land had been quiet. The wind through the canyons whispered peace instead of war cries. The water in Tobias Hartwell's creek flowed gently, feeding the grass that fed his cattle. It was a rare kind of stillness, the kind that lulled men into forgetting how swiftly peace could shatter. And for a man like Tobias, one who'd seen what hate could do to good people, forgetting was a dangerous luxury. That morning, Tobias had risen before the sun, like he always did. His boots crunched over dew-touched earth as he stepped off the porch. He paused only to place something sacred in its rightful place, Chief Takakota's grandfather's warlance. Adorned with eagle feathers, stood tall by the porch rail. The warlance was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of the impossible peace Tobias had helped build. A white man carrying Apache honor. Not out of vanity, but out of something deeper, respect, gratitude, and a love for the people who had once been his enemies. As the morning grew warmer, Tobias busied himself mending fence posts near the creek. The air smelled of cottonwood and distant pine. And for a moment, life felt as it should, normal, simple, and safe. Then the dust came. At first, it was just a smudge on the eastern ridge, nothing more than a shimmer of heat rising off the land. But experience sharpened a man's instincts, and Tobias's gut twisted before his eyes could confirm what his heart already feared. 5 riders, moving fast, their horses slick with sweat, driven too hard, men on a mission, and not the kind that ended in handshakes. The hammer slipped from Tobias's hand. Forgotten in the dirt, he turned his head slowly toward the porch. The warlance stood where he left it, its feathers ruffled in the breeze, catching the sun like flame. But instead of filling him with pride, the sight froze his blood. They weren't coming to pay respect. They were coming for war. With a steady breath, Tobias reached for the rifle he'd started carrying again just last week. Deputy Bradley had warned him, strangers in town, asking pointed questions, dissatisfied with the official version of old sins. There were always men who couldn't let peace be. And today, those men had come knocking. The lead rider pulled up 20 feet from the porch. He was tall and sharp-eyed, with a presence that radiated danger. Tobias didn't recognize him, but he knew his type, the kind of man who believed violence could settle anything. And if it couldn't, then more violence would. But what chilled Tobias was what the man carried draped over his saddle. A blood-stained Apache headband. Fresh blood. Still wet. No, it couldn't be. You Tobias Hartwell? The stranger asked. Though the question was just ceremony. That depends on who's asking. Tobias replied evenly. Clayton Morrison, the man said, smiling with yellow-stained teeth. Colonel Morrison was my brother. The headband, oh God. And this, Clayton added, lifting it like a grotesque trophy, belongs to your Apache friend, the one who murdered him. Tobias's heart pounded. Ayanna had left 3 days ago. A diplomatic mission, carefully arranged. Under federal escort, he was supposed to return tomorrow with news that the peace treaty would expand. He was supposed to be safe. He was supposed to be alive. Where is he? Tobias asked. His voice didn't shake, but inside, everything was breaking. Somewhere you'll never find him. Clayton said, eyes glinting. Unless, of course, you're willing to make a trade. A trade. Not revenge. Not yet. This was something colder. Calculated. Tobias could feel the air grow heavier. 5 guns cocked around him. The porch, once a place of coffee and quiet mornings, had become a noose tightening around his neck. Clayton dismounted with the confidence of a man holding all the cards. He handed Tobias a folded paper. A confession, pre-written, waiting for a signature that would undo everything Tobias had sacrificed to build. If he signed it, Ayanna might live, but the peace? It would die, and in its place, war, fire, ashes. If I sign, Tobias asked quietly, he lives? Clayton's grin widened. For now, but you'll hang, Mr. Hartwell. Treason's still a hanging offense. A silence fell between them. Not just the quiet of fear, but the gravity of a man standing at the edge of the world, knowing that either step forward would cost him everything. Then Clayton offered proof. An Apache prayer cord, the same one Ayanna wore around his neck since childhood. 3 beads, carved by his mother before she passed, taken from Ayanna while he was still breathing. Tobias didn't realize his knees had weakened until he leaned against the porch post. He pictured Ayanna's last words before leaving, I will return with hope. Brother. That was what he'd said. Not victory, not peace, hope. Tobias's mind raced. He couldn't give in, but he couldn't let Ayanna die either. Not after all they'd been through. Not after everything they still hoped to build. You have 1 hour to decide, Clayton said, swinging into his saddle. We'll be at Devil's Canyon. Come alone. Bring the confession, or you'll find pieces of your Apache friend instead. As the riders vanished into the dust, Tobias stood still, one hand on the warlance, the other gripping the prayer beads like a lifeline. 1 hour. But somewhere deep inside, where love and loyalty meet the steel of resolve, Tobias felt something bloom. Not hatred, not despair, but purpose. Ayanna had believed in hope, and Tobias would honor that hope, no matter the cost. As Tobias Hartwell saddled his horse and turned toward Devil's Canyon, the sun dipped low across the horizon, casting long shadows that painted the land in hues of amber and rose. The prayer beads still rested in his shirt pocket, 3 small carved tokens of a promise Ayanna's mother had made to her son. Now a quiet vow Tobias carried on his own heart. With each hoofbeat, the weight of what was asked of him pressed heavier on his shoulders. He knew what this was. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about erasure. Clayton Morrison, the man whose yellow-toothed smile hid a storm of fury, hadn't come to avenge his brother's death. He'd come to restore his legacy, to rewrite the truth with lies signed in desperation and sealed with the blood of a good man. Tobias had seen the kind before, the ones who feared truth because it made them small. They'd rather tear down what was built in justice than let the world remember they once lost to something better. As the wind pulled at Tobias's coat and the canyon drew near, his thoughts turned to Ayanna. He remembered the first time they'd spoken without fear. 2 men from different worlds, sitting beneath a juniper tree, sharing food and words that bridged centuries of pain. Ayanna had asked, "Do you think we'll ever stop being enemies?" Tobias had laughed then. Not out of mockery, but out of disbelief. No, he'd said, I think we'll just forget why we started fighting. Ayanna had smiled. That's how peace begins. Now, Ayanna was in chains, or worse, and Tobias was being asked to bury that hope under a mountain of deceit. The confession Clayton had handed him wasn't just a document. It was a weapon, crafted with precision. Every sentence told a lie meant to burn away what truth remained. It claimed Tobias had fabricated the evidence that exposed Morson's brother, that he had plotted with Ayanna to frame an innocent man. It said that the trials and testimony that followed were the result of a savage's manipulation and a rancher's betrayal. But Tobias knew the truth. So did Ayanna. And truth, no matter how deeply buried, had a way of blooming in sunlight. Devil's Canyon loomed ahead, red stones stacked like the bones of ancient giants, its silence holding secrets and danger alike. Tobias reined in at the canyon's mouth and dismounted. He could see the figures ahead, Clayton on a high ledge, flanked by riflemen, their silhouettes dark against the fading light. His fingers brushed the edge of the folded confession in his coat. But his eyes never left the shadows shifting among the stones. "Right on time," Clayton called out, his voice bouncing between the walls like a sneer. "I was beginning to think you didn't care about your Apache friend." Tobias didn't reply immediately. Instead, he stepped forward with calm born not of certainty, but of purpose. He raised his hand slowly, the folded paper visible. "I came to see him," Tobias said. "Alive." Clayton made a signal, and a figure emerged on a ledge opposite. Bound, bruised, barely upright. Ayanna. Even from a distance, Tobias could see his friend's spirit burning behind swollen eyes. Ayanna stood not like a prisoner, but like a man who refused to bow. A man who believed the ones who loved him would not let him fall alone. Tobias's throat tightened. Hope flickered again. But Clayton wasn't finished. "You signed that paper," he said, "and your savage friend gets to see the sun rise. Don't sign, and we send you what's left of him. One piece at a time." It would have been so easy to give in, to fold beneath the pressure, to trade one truth for one life. But Tobias thought of the children in the villages, of the stories Ayanna had told him, about teaching Apache kids to read, to farm in peace, to dream bigger than war. He thought of Ayanna's promise, made only days ago. "When I return," Ayanna had said, gripping his arm with fierce affection, "we'll build something that lasts longer than memory." Tobias took a breath. "You said this was a trade," he called. "But what you want isn't a trade. It's a betrayal. You want me to kill the truth to keep one man breathing." Clayton's eyes narrowed. "Truth?" he spat. "The truth's whatever the papers say it is. Whatever gets printed in Santa Fe and whispered in the saloons." Tobias's voice didn't rise. Instead, it softened, strengthened by something deeper. "Then we'll write a new truth," he said. He reached into his coat and pulled out not the confession, but a second document, a letter, written in haste and hope, signed by himself and left with Bradley and Santos, men he trusted to carry forward what mattered if he failed. The letter named names, exposed the conspiracy, and called for justice that reached beyond the canyon walls. "I've already told the world what you're trying to do," Tobias said. "Even if I die here, it won't save your brother's legacy. It'll damn it." Clayton's jaw clenched. For a moment, he looked every inch the man who'd ridden through fire and shadow just to silence a truth too heavy for him to bear. Then Tobias stepped closer, his voice low but strong. I loved that man like a brother, he said, nodding toward Ayanna. He gave me hope when all I had was grief. He made me see a world beyond blood and fences. You want me to betray that? You'd have to kill me first. Clayton said nothing, but Ayanna, though bound, lifted his head and smiled, because sometimes hope wasn't in weapons drawn or battles fought. Sometimes it was in the refusal to surrender what mattered. Sometimes it was in love, the kind built on shared pain, healed by shared purpose. And sometimes it was in the strength to say no when the world demanded you say yes. Tobias Hartwell stood at the edge of his porch, staring into the space where the riders had vanished. The canyon winds carried the last echoes of their hoofbeats into silence. The confession still trembled in his hand like a ghost, its words a noose, its ink a weapon. The headband, blood-stained and bitter, clung to his memory like the smell of smoke after fire. But it was Ayanna's face that held him. 3 days ago, Tobias had clasped Ayanna's forearm in farewell. Not goodbye, never that. Come back with peace. Tobias had said, come back alive. I will. Ayanna had replied, with more than peace, with possibility. Now, that possibility was slipping through Tobias's fingers like dry sand. And the weight of the choice before him was unbearable. Sign the confession and save Ayanna. But undo everything they had worked for, every truth exposed. Every life saved by the peace they'd built. Or refuse and watch his brother die. Alone. For a crime he never committed. He turned and looked at the Warlans still standing tall beside his door. The eagle feathers danced softly in the breeze, unaware of the storm closing in. It had once belonged to Chief Takakota's grandfather. Now it stood as a symbol of unity, a quiet defiance against the tide of history. The Apache had trusted him with it. More than that, they had trusted him with their hopes, their future. Tobias was just one man. But to them, he had become something more. An hour. Clayton Morrison had said, you have 1 hour to decide. And what a decision. He could still see Ayanna's smile. The one full of quiet mischief and unshakable faith. Hear his laugh echo across the hills when they'd taught children to fish in the creek. Remember the firelight in his eyes when they had spoken of dreams, schools built on shared soil. Villages no longer separated by fear. Generations that might not grow up with rifles in hand. They'd called each other brothers. Not for show, not as a performance, but because in a world broken by blood and betrayal, they'd chosen each other, and choices, Tobias had learned, were what shaped legacies. But what was the value of a single life compared to the fragile peace that hung in balance? He ran a hand through his hair, the old weariness sinking back into his bones. There were no easy answers here, only consequences. But then a memory came to him. So vivid it hurt. It was the night of Ayanna's first stay at the ranch. After supper, they had stood under the stars. Tobias had pointed out constellations in English. Ayanna had shared their Apache names. One of them, Ayanna had said, meant the path of return. When we walk in truth, Ayanna had told him that night, we always find our way back. Tobias closed his eyes. What was truth worth, if it cost a life? What was love worth, if it refused to act? And could hope survive if he chose either path? A breeze swept across the porch, lifting the confession slightly. as if urging him toward decision. Tobias stared at it for a long moment. Then he folded it again and tucked it inside his coat, not as acceptance, but as acknowledgement, because he would make the choice. But not on Clayton's terms. Not with despair. He walked into the house, packed a satchel with paper, ink, and a clean shirt. Then he loaded his revolver, checked it, loaded it again, not because he planned to kill, but because sometimes hope walked best when armed against those who did not believe in it. Next, he picked up the war lance. He held it carefully, reverently, like one holds an heirloom passed down not through blood, but through belief. Then he stepped outside and stared down the trail that led to town. He would not be alone in this. And even if he was, he would not carry this weight without purpose. He mounted his horse, the war lance strapped to his saddle and the prayer beads near his heart. The sun had begun its descent, painting the land in golden light, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the entire territory. In that light, he felt Ayana's presence, not just as a friend in peril, but as a brother who had trusted him completely. They had shared meals, memories, scars. They had buried fallen kin together. They had stood between two worlds, not to divide them, but to hold them closer. Tobias Hartwell would not let that be erased. Not for fear, not for convenience, and certainly not for a man like Clayton Morrison, whose idea of justice came with a price tag. "I'll bring you home," Tobias whispered into the wind, "even if I have to rewrite the world to do it." The hoofbeats that carried him to town were not frantic, but firm, each one steady, sure, because hope is not a firework. It is a heartbeat, and love, the kind that saves, never rushes, but never falters either. As the town came into view, Tobias knew the decision had already been made. He would not choose between Ayana's life and the truth. He would fight for both. Because the heart of peace was not compromise. It was courage. The road to town had never felt so long. Tobias Hartwell rode like a man haunted by both urgency and faith. Urgency, because time was his enemy, an hour ticking fast toward a canyon steeped in danger. Faith, because the man he was racing to save had once told him, "We cannot demand peace unless we're willing to bleed for it." Ayana had bled. Now Tobias would ride. Dust rose behind him in a silver cloud, chasing the thunder of hooves that echoed across the land. His heart beat in rhythm with the war lance strapped to his saddle, its eagle feathers trailing behind like prayer flags in motion. The ancient weapon wasn't just a relic, it was a promise. It had stood beside him when bullets flew, when truth burned, and when men tried to bury justice beneath lies. Now it would ride with him again. Main Street was mostly empty when Tobias arrived, the early evening hush falling over the town like a held breath. A few heads turned as he galloped past, but no one stopped him. The people here knew better than to question the man who carried both a rifle and the respect of a nation. Some nodded, some stepped back. One old woman even whispered a quiet blessing in Apache as he passed. At the sheriff's office, Deputy Bradley looked up from his desk, startled. "Tobias?" he said, rising to his feet. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon." "What's wrong?" "They've got him," Tobias said. No pleasantries, no softening the truth. Clayton Morrison and 4 gunmen. They're holding Ayanna at Devil's Canyon. They want me to sign a false confession. Bradley paled. What? Morrison has a brother? Had. Tobias corrected quietly. Now he wants a legacy. He thinks destroying me will give it back. The young deputy's hand hovered near his weapon. We'll get Sheriff Mackenzie. Form a posse. No time. Tobias interrupted. And no cavalry charges. They see us coming. They'll kill Ayanna before we get within rifle range. He paused, looking Bradley in the eye. But there's another way. Bradley leaned forward, listening. Tobias reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The ink was still drying, but the message it carried had already taken root in Tobias's soul. Take this to Miguel Santos at the trading post. Tell him it's from Brother Wolf. Bradley blinked. Brother Wolf? That's what the Apache call me. Tobias said. Miguel will know. He'll get word to Chief Takakota. Fast. The deputy opened the note. His eyes widened as he read. You want to summon them? Again? I don't want to. Tobias said. But I will. Because if they kill Ayanna, the war will come back. All of it. And this time, no one walks away clean. Bradley looked up. And what about you? I'm going to Devil's Canyon. Tobias said. Alone. Like they asked. Bradley's expression darkened. You'll be outgunned, outnumbered, and cornered. I know. Tobias adjusted the warlance on his saddle. But I won't be outlawed. Bradley stared at him. Ayanna called me his brother. Tobias said softly. He believed in me when no one else did. He taught me a new way to see the world. If I let him die now, what does that make me? The silence between them was thick with emotion. Then Bradley nodded, folding the note. I'll ride fast, he promised. What about a signal? Tobias thought for a moment. If you hear shots, ride harder. Bradley clasped Tobias's forearm. Come back alive, not alone. Tobias replied, as he left the office. The town seemed to hold its breath again. People peeked from behind curtains and storefronts. They didn't know what was happening. But they felt it. Something bigger than any one man. Something sacred. Tobias stopped once more at the edge of town. Taking in the horizon, Devil's Canyon waited beyond those hills. So did blood, maybe death, but also, maybe, salvation. Ayanna had gone south to build something beautiful. Tobias would go west to protect it. The ride to Devil's Canyon was quieter than he expected. The evening sun cast golden stripes across the land. In the distance, birds wheeled in the sky. Even the wind felt gentler, as if the earth itself was urging him forward, whispering, "Hold fast, you are not alone." He remembered a lesson Ayanna had once shared beside a campfire. The warrior doesn't ride for himself. He rides for those who pray behind him. And Tobias knew. He wasn't just riding for Ayanna. He was riding for every child who now slept in peace. For every elder who dared believe that enemies could become brothers. For the settlers and the tribes who had begun to look at one another not with suspicion, but with hope. As he crested the final ridge before the canyon, Tobias saw the first faint trail of smoke. A fire. Waiting. Guns. Waiting. A choice. Waiting. But so was love. A brother's bond that could not be broken. And a world that could still be saved. If only he had the courage to ride into its heart. Devil's Canyon was a scar across the earth, deep, narrow, and steeped in silence. The towering red cliffs rose like ancient sentinels, bearing witness to every drop of blood spilled between them. It was the kind of place where things ended, where sound vanished and the truth echoed louder than voices. Tobias Hartwell rode in slowly, every instinct screaming caution. The warlance rested across his lap, the feathers fluttering gently in the evening wind. He wasn't here for war. Not if he could help it. But he had not come empty-handed either. His heart beat in a steady rhythm, driven by love, steadied by hope. On the high ledge, Clayton Morrison stood like a preacher in a pulpit, his rifle pointed down toward Tobias, his voice bouncing off the canyon walls. "Right on time, Hartwell," he called. "I was beginning to think you didn't care about your Apache friend." Tobias didn't answer. He knew better than to waste words on a man who had no intention of listening. Instead, he scanned the cliffs and shadows, noting the positions. One man high above with a rifle, two crouched behind boulders near the canyon mouth, another somewhere behind him, and one more, unseen, possibly guarding Ayanna. He dismounted slowly, deliberately, letting them see he came alone. A show of faith, yes, but more importantly, a moment to buy time. "I brought what you asked for," he said, pulling a folded paper from his coat. Not the confession they expected, but a letter of truth, signed, witnessed, and entrusted to others in case he never returned. Clayton's smile twisted cruelly. "Show me Ayanna." A pause. Then a shadow moved on the opposite ledge. A figure was dragged forward, bound, bloodied, slumped but alive. Tobias's breath caught in his chest. Ayanna, even bruised and broken. The Apache diplomat radiated dignity. He lifted his head just enough to meet Tobias's eyes. That one glance said more than 1,000 words. It said, "I knew you'd come." "You satisfied?" Clayton called. "I want him down here before I hand this over." Tobias replied. Clayton gave a signal, and the man holding Ayanna tightened his grip. The blade at Ayanna's throat gleamed in the fading light. "Throw it up first," Clayton said, "then we'll talk." But before Tobias could move, another voice cut through the canyon like the crack of thunder. "Or," it said, "you can all drop your weapons and surrender peacefully." Everyone turned toward the sound. There, at the canyon's entrance, stood Deputy Bradley. His silhouette was framed by the setting sun, his badge flashing like a promise. His rifle was aimed directly at the back of Tucker's head. Tobias felt a surge of emotion, relief, fear, and something stronger, loyalty. He'd told Bradley not to follow, but he had come anyway. For justice, for Ayanna, for peace. Clayton's face twisted in fury. "I told you to come alone." "He did," Bradley replied. "I followed on my own. I'm not letting this territory fall back into blood just because you're too bitter to let your brother rest." Tobias's stomach dropped. Bradley's presence, well meant as it was, changed everything. Clayton had no more reason to pretend, no more incentive to keep Ayanna alive. Then the arrows came. The first struck Clayton's rifle, splintering the stock and sending the weapon spinning. The second buried itself in the shoulder of the man holding Ayanna, causing him to stumble back and drop his captive. From the canyon rim, Apache warriors emerged like spirits from stone. Not many, just 6, but each positioned with precision. Bows drawn, eyes fierce. Chief Takakota's voice rang out in perfect English. Clayton Morrison, he said, the name like a sentence passed down through centuries. You have violated the peace treaty by attacking an Apache diplomat under federal protection. Surrender now and face white man's justice. Resist and face ours. The canyon fell into stillness. Tobias looked at Clayton. The man's rage had become panic. His careful plan was crumbling like dust in a storm. Then Tucker moved, raising his pistol toward Bradley. And others followed, one drawing a knife, another cocking a rifle. Ayanna, still dazed, tried to move. Tobias stepped forward, raising his voice, not with rage, but with resolve. Tucker, he shouted, look around. You shoot that deputy. You're not just fighting me. You're fighting the United States government. You kill that Apache. You're not just breaking the law. You're starting a war that will burn this land from here to Santa Fe. The gun wavered. Uncertainty flickered. Do you think Morrison's legacy is worth that? Tobias pressed. Thousands dead? Peace destroyed? Is that the history you want your children to remember? Clayton spat blood and hatred. Pretty words, Hartwell, but we're past talking. Are we? Tobias said, lifting the war lance. The feathers glowed in the sunset. The symbol unmistakable. Because I have more than words. I have truth. I have witnesses. I have letters sent to the governor. To the marshal's office. To the papers in Santa Fe. Even if you kill us all, by dawn the whole world will know what you did. Silence again. Then the man holding Ayanna shifted. Clay, he said nervously. Maybe we should. But before he could finish, more hoofbeats thundered through the canyon. Not Apache this time. Federal cavalry. Bradley smiled grimly. I sent word to Fort Richardson. The final blow. Clayton's carefully woven lie had unraveled. Thread by thread, surrounded by warriors, lawmen, and the power of truth. His only weapon now was desperation. But Tobias didn't look at him. He looked at Ayanna, who, supported by 2 Apache warriors, stood upright, wounded but unbroken. In that moment, Tobias felt something powerful, stronger than anger, deeper than justice. It was love, and the hope that peace, fragile though it was, had survived one more storm. Blank. Underscore. Blank. In the silence that followed the cavalry's approach, time seemed to stretch thin as paper. A canyon full of armed men stood frozen, waiting for someone, anyone, to strike the match that would ignite everything. But Tobias Hartwell stood still, war lance in hand, heart thundering with the weight of a choice that had no room for violence. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Not in blood, not in death. 6 months ago, he had promised Chief Takakota, Ayanna, and himself that peace would be more than a fragile dream. Now, with rifles pointed, knives drawn, and fear climbing into every crevice of Devil's Canyon, that promise teetered on the edge. And then, Tobias spoke, not with a war cry, but with love. Tucker, he said, steady and loud, look around. His voice rose with the clarity of someone who had nothing left to lose, but everything left to protect. 6 Apache warriors with bows trained on you. A federal deputy at your back. And me. Just a rancher who's got a war lance and a whole lot more heart than sense. Tucker's pistol wavered, his scarred face uncertain for the first time. You shoot him, Tobias continued, nodding toward Deputy Bradley. And you're not just killing a man. You're killing every chance this land has for peace. The words hit harder than gunfire. Because they weren't threats, they were truth. Plain, honest, human. And you. Tobias turned toward the man still gripping Ayanna by the shoulder. You slit that man's throat. And you don't just murder a diplomat. You murder every child who dreams of growing up without a rifle in their hand. He saw it then. The fear giving way to something else. Doubt, guilt, humanity, maybe even hope. Clayton Morrison staggered to his feet. Still bloodied, still burning with rage. "Shut up," he screamed. "You think words are going to save you? My brother was worth 10 of your savage friends." But Tobias stood his ground. "No," he said, "your brother lied, cheated, and bled this territory dry. Ayanna fought for peace. And peace, real peace, is worth more than any uniform or badge or legacy carved from hate." Clayton's hand twitched near a hidden pistol. Tobias's voice softened, shifting from fire to something warmer. Steadier. "I wrote letters, Clay. They're already out there. Governor's reading one now. So's the federal marshal. So's the editor in Santa Fe." He held the war lance high. The eagle feathers shimmered in the dying light like hope made visible. "Even if we die here, people will know what you did, why you did it, and who stood against it." Clayton's eyes darted, wild and uncertain. "You're bluffing." Tobias met his gaze and smiled gently. "Try me." The man gripping Ayanna stepped back, his knife lowering. His face was pale, haunted by the realization that they'd all walked into a story that would outlive them. A story they could no longer control. Bradley's voice rang out next. "Clayton Morrison," he said, rifle steady, badge gleaming. "You are under arrest for kidnapping, attempted murder, and conspiracy against a federal diplomat. Surrender now and face the law." But it was Chief Takakota's voice, echoing from the canyon rim. That brought silence like a prayer. In Apache and English, he called, "Justice will be served, whether by your law or ours. But there will be justice." Clayton staggered, cornered by truth, stripped of lies, surrounded by men who had chosen hope over hate. Then the final hammer fell. The thunder of cavalry hooves filled the canyon. Closer now, undeniable, the sound of rescue, of judgment, of tomorrow. And yet, Tobias still held the war lance aloft. Not like a weapon, but like a banner. "This is how we win," he said, softer now. "Not with blood, with truth, with love, with the kind of courage that forgives when it could have killed. With the hope that one life saved is worth 100 battles won." The man holding Ayanna let go. Gently. Ayanna slumped, weak but upright, his gaze locked on Tobias. And in his eyes was gratitude that went deeper than language. Because Tobias hadn't just come to save him. He had come to save everything they had built. Then Clayton did the unthinkable. He let out a wild, broken laugh, the sound of a man unraveling. He screamed that it wasn't over. That his brother was still a hero. That they would all pay. He drew his last weapon. Not toward Tobias. Not toward the deputy. But toward his own man. "Bobby," he shouted, "cut his throat or I'll shoot you myself." Madness. Desperation. Tobias didn't wait. He threw the war lance with every ounce of love that had ever lived in his bones. Not just for Ayanna, Not just for peace. For the children. For the treaties. For the future. It struck Bobby just as the blade moved. The force threw him backward, the knife spinning harmlessly away. Ayanna fell to his knees, but free. Clayton screamed, raised his pistol. A shot rang out, but not from him. Bradley's rifle cracked once. Clean. True. Clayton dropped like a man felled not by lead, but by truth. The canyon was still again. Two of the gunmen dropped their weapons without being asked. The others simply froze, stunned by the miracle of what had just happened. Ayanna stood slowly, leaning on a warrior's shoulder. His voice hoarse. "You didn't fight," he whispered. "No," Tobias said, picking up the warlance. "We didn't have to." And for the first time in a long while, hope didn't just flicker in Devil's Canyon. It soared. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The moment before everything breaks is always quiet. After Clayton Morrison's wild demand, threatening to kill Ayanna through his own man if the false confession wasn't signed, the canyon held its breath. No bird sang. No wind stirred. The air pressed heavy against the earth, and every man standing in Devil's Canyon knew they were balanced on a knife's edge. Tobias Hartwell could see it all in one frozen heartbeat. Bobby's hands trembled around the hilt of the knife pressed to Ayanna's throat. Ayanna knelt, bloodied but still proud, still watching Tobias with those eyes full of calm trust. The other gunmen looked from one another to the Apache warriors lining the canyon rim. Bows drawn and faces unreadable. Deputy Bradley stood firm behind his rifle, aimed and ready but not eager to fire. And Clayton, madness glinting in his eyes, had a gun aimed at his own man's back. Spittle flying as he screamed, "Kill him now or I'll do it myself." It would have taken one shot to end it all, Ayanna's life. The fragile peace, every ounce of progress forged from months of hard, hopeful labor, one slice of a blade, and the Apache would have every right to rain justice from the canyon walls. One pull of a trigger, and Devil's Canyon would become a mass grave of good intentions. But Tobias didn't move out of fear. He moved out of love. He stepped forward, not raising his gun, not calling a bluff. He did what few men had the courage to do when death waited at every corner. He trusted. He reached for the warlance, the same sacred weapon passed to him in ceremony 6 months earlier. Not just a tool of war, but a symbol of protection, a guardian's oath carved into polished wood and steel. Tobias Hartwell took that warlance in hand and remembered every reason he was standing here. Ayanna's laughter, Takakota's wisdom, the children in the villages, the settlers who had stopped fearing their neighbors, the water he had once offered to a stranger under a sweltering sun. And he threw it, not with anger, but with every ounce of faith and brotherhood and desperate, stubborn hope he could summon. The warlance flew. It spun through the air like a promise. Its eagle feathers flashed in the last gold light of evening. The silence stretched impossibly thin. Then came the sound of impact. It struck Bobby's center mass, knocking the air from his lungs and the knife from his hand. The man stumbled backward off the ledge, arms flailing, his body crashing to the rocks below. The blade spun harmlessly away. Ayanna collapsed forward, freed at last. Clayton roared like a wounded animal, his pale eyes crazed. "You killed my last chance," he screamed. "You think I'll let you walk away from this?" His pistol shifted, swung toward Tobias. But the trigger never fell. Bradley fired first. The bullet struck Clayton clean through the chest. The man's body jerked, his gun tumbling from his grasp as he collapsed in a heap of dust and fury. His final breath was not a curse, but a shocked silence, as if even he hadn't believed the end would come so swiftly. Then everything stopped. No war, no chaos, just the wind, finally returning, whispering through the canyon as though it, too, had been holding its breath. The two remaining gunmen looked at the still body of their leader. Then at the silent witnesses surrounding them. They dropped their weapons with slow, trembling hands. Ayanna was surrounded in moments, Apache warriors steadying him. Bradley rushing forward to check his pulse. The cavalry clattered in at last. Too late to intervene but in time to secure the canyon. Tobias stood where he had thrown the lance. His chest rising and falling with deep, uneven breaths. He walked forward and retrieved the weapon from Bobby's fallen body. The shaft was still strong. The feathers still intact, the steel tip unmarred, ready to serve again. But God, Tobias hoped it never had to. Ayanna, supported on either side, turned to him. His face was pale, his movements slow, but his eyes, always the most expressive part of him, shone with quiet triumph. "You always come," he whispered in Apache. Tobias smiled, the war lance in one hand, the prayer beads still near his heart. "Always," he replied in the same tongue. Family protects family. And in that moment, the canyon, once a place chosen for death, became the birthplace of a second chance. Not just for two men bound by brotherhood, but for everyone who believed that love could do what violence never could. Blank. Blank. The porch creaked gently beneath Tobias Hartwell's boots as he set down a second cup of coffee. Steam curling into the crisp autumn air. The leaves had begun to turn, painting the valley in gold and red. It had been weeks since Devil's Canyon, but the echo of what had happened there still lingered in the silence. Not in sorrow, but in gratitude. Across from him sat Captain William Hayes of the U.S. Marshal Service. The weary weight of federal authority lining his face. "We finished digging," Hayes said, voice low, accepting the cup with a nod. Morrison wasn't acting alone. Payments traced back to arms dealers in Chicago. Munitions from Baltimore. Some from men in D.C. who'd rather see war than treaties. Tobias's fingers tightened around his mug. They would have started the Apache Wars all over again. "They tried," Hayes said. "You stopped them." But Tobias shook his head slowly. "We stopped them. All of us." It was true, not just the moment at Devil's Canyon, where bullets gave way to words and courage outshone cruelty, but the days that followed. Apache and federal investigators had worked together. Testimonies were gathered. The names of conspirators filled more pages than anyone wanted to believe. But what had once been hidden in shadows now faced the daylight. Still, the world moved forward. Deputy Bradley had been sworn in as interim sheriff, federal backing behind his badge and his unwavering sense of right. New laws were being drafted to protect peacekeepers, diplomats, and tribal leaders. A generation of hope was being written in ink that no war profiteer could erase. And then Hayes said the words that made Tobias's hands shake. "There's something else," He pulled a letter from his coat, thick parchment with a gold seal pressed deep into the envelope. Official, presidential. Tobias opened it with slow, reverent fingers. It was a commendation, signed by President Taylor himself. Recognition of Tobias Hartwell's extraordinary efforts to preserve peace between the United States and the Apache Nation. But more than that, it was an offer. Federal Indian Agent for the Southwest Territory. Hayes explained. Direct line to Washington. No interference from local corruption. Work with the tribes. Keep the treaties alive. Expand them. Tobias stared at the paper. The title. The scope of it. He'd once been just a rancher, mending fences, tending cattle, trying to stay out of everyone's way. Now, the future of a region could rest on his shoulders. There's one condition, Hayes added, gently. Chief Takakoda has to approve. As if summoned by the moment. Hoofbeats echoed down the valley road. But not with urgency this time. Not with dust and fear. These were ceremonial steps, steady, rhythmic, full of intention. A procession of Apache elders approached the ranch. At their head rode Chief Takakoda, his long silver hair braided with reverence, his eyes bright with something between pride and serenity. Behind him rode Ayana, fully healed, carrying something wrapped in cloth. Tobias stepped down from the porch. No words were spoken at first. None were needed. The elders formed a circle in the yard. Takakoda dismounted, his presence grounding the air like an anchor. One by one, the elders spoke of what Tobias had done, what he had risked, what he had refused to surrender, even when surrender would have saved his life. Finally, Takakoda unwrapped the bundle, a second war lance, new, unbloodied, crafted with exquisite care. Its shaft carved with symbols from both cultures. Olive branches woven into eagle feathers. Apache prayers beside English scripture. And at the tip, a single word in both languages, peace. You were given the lance of a warrior. Takakoda said, today, we offer you the lance of a peace chief. He held it out, not as a gift, but as a trust. Accept it, he continued, and you become not just a brother, but a guardian. Of treaties, of lives, of futures not yet born. Tobias looked around the circle, at Ayana. At the children who had come to watch. At the ranch hands who had quietly joined from the distance. His gaze met Hayes, then Bradley's, and finally, the old chief's. I accept, he said. The ceremony that followed would remain legend. White and Apache voices rose together in song and prayer. The peace lance was lifted under starlight. Children danced barefoot across the grass. Fires burned long into the night. Not for mourning, but for celebration. Later, Ayana presented Tobias with a drawing. Made by the children of both communities. It showed two figures standing beneath a shared sun, one with a war lance, the other with an olive branch, both shielding a group of children with outstretched arms. They drew this, Ayana said softly, to show what they want their world to look like. Tobias traced the lines with reverence. A place where warriors fight for peace. Ayana smiled. Exactly. 2 years later, Tobias Hartwell wore many titles. Federal Indian Agent, Apache Peace Chief, husband to a schoolteacher named Sarah who believed as fiercely in dreams as he did. Father to 3 children who spoke both English and Apache before they could ride. He split his time between Washington meetings and tribal councils. He carried 2 war lances, one for war, one for peace, but only ever drew the second. And every year, on the day it had all begun, he returned to the well behind his ranch, the one where he had once offered water to a stranger. He would sit there, alone for a while, remembering how everything had changed with that single act of kindness. Because in the end, he'd come to understand something simple and sacred. The world doesn't change through battles. It changes when one person chooses love over fear. When one person believes that peace can be stronger than hate. And when that person refuses to give up, even when standing alone in a canyon full of guns.